From the Sky News Centre, this is Paul Murray Live.
Love you, Corey. Those better days, they are always maybe just one sleep away. But before we go to bed tonight, lots to get on the show this evening. We need the full hour, so let's not muck around. It's been a huge weekend in Queensland, and I'm not just talking about the supercars. Congrats, of course, to David Reynolds and Cameron Waters for their wins this weekend on the GC, but let's talk about the fires that have been taking place towards the west of Toowoomba. Areas like Tara have been grossly affected. We've talked about this for the past couple of days, but I wanted everyone to know that we were thinking of them at the start of today's show. More than 40 homes have been destroyed. 2 people have died. People have been returning to their homes slowly but surely. They are coming back to virtually nothing. There's a great story on Channel 9 on Friday night when I was in Queensland where a house was completely gone. They've lost everything, but the little boy was okay because his bike was outside and was left unaffected. He'll have the trauma coming in the next few weeks and months, but he's had a smile on his face this afternoon. But again, strength and love to everyone who's fighting the fires and those that have been going through it for the past few days in the mighty state of Queensland.
You started there. That's taken off. There's a guy in there trying to put it out. He needs help.
It's just you can't afford to take a chance, really. You know,
It's not worth the risk.
Yeah, I know a couple of people who've lost everything. It's one. You know, it's here now and now it's gone. You know, it's just horrendous.
Again, please, all summer long, if a fire's coming your way, please listen to the emergency services people. We prefer them to overhype it than you to be underprepared. So strength and love for the Aussie summer that will claim more homes and probably, sadly, more lives. A couple of weeks ago, when the referendum was hell no from Australia to the recognition of Indigenous people in the Constitution, but more importantly, the hell no came because the Prime Minister wouldn't split the questions, and it was, of course, the defeat of The Voice. I said that one of the things that was going to happen was that the press gallery was going to go the full Trump or the full Morrison on Peter Dutton as the man who they will punish for denying the ACT and the Teal seats what they believed was the right thing to do. Now, it doesn't matter that Peter Dutton, of course, spent more time in Alice Springs than the Prime Minister did before he buggered off and had 3 days at the tennis. It doesn't matter that Peter Dutton, if you would vote for him the Prime Minister at the next federal election, that Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price will be his Indigenous Affairs Minister, as opposed to the disaster that has been Linda Burney. He will have to pay. And the gallery has spent much of this weekend starting that process. It's now full. He will get the full Trump treatment, which means everything's a scandal. He'll get the full Morrison treatment, which is every idea is a bad idea. Why? Because they think if they can create so much noise that the deal is don't vote for them and the noise goes away, that you won't vote for them. But of course, Australia is in a different place than where it was in the lead up to the last federal election. And no, not just because China is not trying to punish us as they did previously. Of course, the Roy Morgan Company may well be searching for a headline, but they're the first of the major polls to say that on two-party preferred, the coalition is in front. Newspoll says that is well and truly not the case, and Labor would still be in front, but most likely would be headed towards minority government. And what about the reporting of James Campbell today about how dirty Labor plans to play between now and the next federal election? The story they had today was Albanese returns home firing up a dirt unit on Peter Dutton, as if Malcolm Turnbull didn't try it, as if the Labor Party hasn't tried it in the past. But according to James, Labor sources have told the Sunday Telegraph that staff in the Prime Minister's office in recent weeks have been diverted into a research unit targeted on investigating the government's opponents. That would, of course, in part include organisations like ours, which is why they plan to censor the internet, so you can't see what we say here each and every night. Oh no, of course, it's about going after misinformation. Pull the other one and place jingle bells. The decision to position it inside the Prime Minister's office has raised some eyebrows inside government, because put simply, this is not really what the Prime Minister's office is for. That's normally the stuff of senators and backbenchers. One source says that since The Voice, it has been declared they are going to focus on going after Dutton personally, which is why a compliant press gallery is helpful for the Labor Party in doing this, because remember, much of the press gallery either called it or got it wrong in what they wanted Australia to do when it came to that referendum. They still think that it matters about this booth in this seat as opposed to no in every state in the country and the Northern Territory. So Peter Harcher, one of the great hatchet people on the behalf of the left of Australian politics, the one who did in Tony Abbott and again tried to do in Scott Morrison, Well, he's now having a crack at Peter Dutton for joining the people in and around the Hunter region who don't want wind farms to be placed off their coastline. There was even the smart alecky cartoon of a hapless Peter Dutton riding in on horseback to try to attack what we know is going to be a major issue in Labor seats and non-Labor seats. But he wasn't the only one doing the government's bidding. As the dirt unit begins, the types of people who will spread the dirt around, well-placed people like Peter Harcher, people like Catherine Murphy over at The Guardian, of course, plenty of appearances on the ABC to give the air cover to all of this nonsense. She says that Albanese's been submerged in meh since the Voice defeat, and Peter Dutton is eyeing a knockout blow. And just miraculously, she too decided to go after Peter Dutton for going to Port Stephens to attack the offshore wind farms that locals can't stand. Isn't this amazing? The Prime Minister's office starts a dirt unit and two of the people that will spread it around say exactly the same thing when it comes to the weekend. Australia took the piss-weak position of abstaining a recent United Nations vote calling on Israel to have a ceasefire in its hunt for Hamas to get some more humanitarian aid in, something the United States outright said no to, but Australia didn't even have the balls to vote on. And that too was noted by The Guardian, that Peter Dutton has been accused of trying to gain political advantage. It's not political advantage, it's about saying that he's dead straight on who he thinks the good guys are, and people will judge him overall. Another one of the people that will be providing plenty of spread for the Prime Minister's dirt unit, Laura Tingle, over at the ABC, but her side hustle is that she's able to not just give editorials at 7:30 each and every night, but she's able to do so in print. Her side hustle is to write a column for the Financial Review that they also double up on the ABC's website. A disturbing lack of bipartisanship on Middle East conflict points to an ugly new direction for Australian politics. His comments came at a time where there have already been predictions that on the back of ugly divisions, the coalition was happy to stir up over the Voice. Remember, the Voice was 60-40 until that evil Peter Dutton got involved, and thus he must pay. That it would target migration at the next election. Now, why does that ring a bell for us of one of the things that the dirt unit of the Labor Party and the people who are going to be the chief recipients of this dirt to smear and spread around liberally between now and the next federal election? That Peter Dutton's too extreme for Australia, despite the fact that he was where the majority of Australians were, on the union focus of the Labor Party and its industrial relations legislation, and more importantly, the focus on cost of living, while the government has been, among other things, spending $450 million on a referendum that they knew that they would lose for months. Well, the suggestion that to weaponise immigration would be part of the evil play of the evil Dutton was, of course, nasty Nikki Sava. Writing in the Fairfax Press, as it used to be called, or the Channel 9 newspapers, remember, she has previously said, this is a no-go zone, you must not talk about the fact that 1.5 million people will be added to all of the queues, all of the problems, all of the housing, all of the cost of living, all of the issues that mean ambulance ramping is the worst that it's ever been in most Labor states around the country, which of course is all states with the exception of Tasmania. It is an issue that's most ripe for exploitation, says the self-admitted liar, because it can feed into every grievance and prejudice, including from migrants, because God forbid migrants to this country don't just think exclusively along we're an ethnic minority, we should vote for the Labor Party. Instead, she continues here to say that houses are too expensive, roads are too congested, can't find a job or get into a hospital bed, whatever ails you, blame immigration. And of course, Albanese. Well, yeah, you're allowed to. You see, it's this government that has decided to add an extra 1.5 million people in the next 5 years, and they've already cracked 500,000 in the first 12 months of a goal that was supposed to get us to 900,000 in 2 years. This is the government that produced the intergenerational report earlier this year that says that an extra 40 million people will end up being added to the country over the next 40 or so years. But nothing to see here. That the same people are projecting budget deficits every year there is to come for the next 40 years. But dare complain about it and you're falling for an evil plot. Watch this space, because while the press gallery are going to want to do Dutton damage and they're going to want to pretend that the biggest issue in the world is Peter Dutton's opinion on this, that or the other, there's plenty of stories that they are choosing not to cover. like Richard Marles. And remember the taxpayer-funded plane from the Labor Party conference to Sydney for the Matildas, back to the Labor Party conference in Brisbane? Nothing to see here. Perfect example of this double standard about stories that should well make the news, but you don't hear about them because it's all about getting Dutton now. It's all about punishing Price. And it's all about trying to tell the Australian people that they got it wrong when they decided to vote their own conscience, their own intelligence at the referendum, which was not close. You may remember when the current finance minister and one of the mean girls, the one who, of course, lied to the Senate about what she knew and when, all in and around the matters of the Parliament of a couple of years ago, after being tipped off by people who were more than happy to play their part in spreading the dirt around. Well, she said there'd be no more of this jobs for the boys. The people that will be hired by this government will be people that are the right people for the job.
We can't have rorts, we can't have, jobs for mates.
No more jobs for mates. Well, the Trade Minister, Don Farrell, disagrees with this new edict, or knows that most of the gallery is just desperately waiting for the spoon feeding of the dirt unit from the Prime Minister's office. Because a person has been given a trade job on the behalf of Australia in the United States who, get this, didn't even apply for the job. No, instead, a person who did apply for the job and the selection committee said is the right person for the job was this woman. Yet, as the Australian newspaper has been reporting, because they're not interested in the dirt unit, that the person who actually got the job was a former Labor politician. One who, I repeat, didn't even apply for the job. So the qualified lady, the selection panel says pick her. Don Farrell says, nah, I got a mate who now gets a plum job paid for by you to be a trade representative of Australia in the United States. The Trade Minister appointed his friend, Chris Ketter, who served one term as a backbench senator. He will be Australia's next Senior Trade and Investment Commissioner and Consul General, which means Deputy Ambassador, in a place called San Francisco. The Australian can reveal that Kristen Thompson, who was the head of America's investment desk at the Australian Trade and Investment Commission, known as Austrade, was the preferred candidate. She was supposed to get the job. But Senator Farrell's office dumped the recruitment process after it was completed and picked the Labor bloke anyway. Mr. Ketter, was a Labor staffer since losing his Senate job in 2019 and has no experience in the trade and investment area and did not apply for the job. Oh, but there's no scandal here. All of those reporters that have been doing Dutton for the past few days, no interest in this story. In fact, some follow-up reporting confirms exactly what I have just said. The Australian newspaper this weekend has said that Don Farrell has admitted that he did dump the female candidate for the Labor mate. If this was the Libs, it'd be front page. It'd be your 6 p.m. news. Oh, they'd be devoting a solid 12 minutes to it on Insiders. The Saturday paper would have had a whole blow-by-blow, and don't get me started on what Laura Tingle would have done on the 7:30 report. The Trade Minister confirmed that he dumped Austrade's recommendation to appoint Ms Thompson and personally picked a former one-term senator, and union official. Pressed to explain Mr Ketter's trade development experience, the senator said his long-time political ally and friend was an advocate and negotiator in industry, which means he's a former union official, and the public service and the government is what he had worked for. This is red hot. Now, okay, governments have the opportunity to pick whoever they want to go into these posts, but don't go through the dog and pony show of getting other people to apply for a job that a panel of people say they should get if your plan is to give it to a Labor mate who didn't even apply for the job. Oh, but there's nothing to see here because did you hear about Peter Dutton going to Nelson Bay? That's the real story. And of course, these are the same people who have no interest in following up on the central lie in the Prime Minister's election campaign that he has absolutely failed to deliver on halfway through his first term as Prime Minister. Because their aim is if you don't remind people that Labor promised that they would lower the cost of living, then somehow, The Australian people will just completely focus on how evil the other guy is as opposed to the failure of the guy who's currently there. So let me do the job that they won't. Here's just a few things that they might want to focus on in the next little while, but of course they'll just spread the dirt around from the Prime Minister's dirt unit. The 11 interest rate rises that have happened on his watch, the record high petrol prices that he won't axe the tax on despite having a budget surplus, power prices that he promised to go down but have actually gone way up, inflation, which of course has continued to go up and started going up again in the past couple of months, means everything costs more. A low Australian dollar means everything we import to the country costs more. He took $1,500 from 10 million workers via their tax returns, and as we've shown you before, about 35% of the country rely upon their tax returns to pay some of their major bills. Of course, he's introducing new superannuation taxes, but that only affects really rich people, so it doesn't matter, despite the fact that they worked hard and they planned for their own retirement. Oh yeah, they haven't delivered on the 24/7 nurses pledge in aged care, but Peter Dutton went to Nelson Bay. He's promised a much more transparent government, but of course there are 2,000 questions on notice that haven't been answered in the Senate, and only now we might get the chance to look at the Prime Minister's diary. They're trying to censor the internet. Oh, it's all about cutting it back on misinformation. No, they're censoring the internet and only government truths may be known. This is on top of $450 million, which was spent on the Voice referendum, and there's even more huge waste of money I'll get to in a moment or two's time. But now, more than 2 weeks after Australia said hell no to the Voice, there is still more to report about the reaction to it. Now, of course, the press gallery, well, they were quite gleeful in the punishing of Jacinta Price, barely even reporting her attempts to get a royal commission into what was happening in Indigenous communities, particularly when it comes to sexual violence and kids. Oh, no, that's just political. Well, Jacinta Price, again, showing that if you vote for Peter Dutton, you get her as the Indigenous Affairs Minister, a very powerful point that I'm sure Peter Dutton will make many times between now and the next election, or you can vote for Albo and get Linda Burney, unless, of course, Linda Burney may well end up becoming the next Governor-General. That was the story around last week. Admittedly, one line in the Daily Mail, but you get my point. Well, Thomas Mayo, one of the blokes who helped drive the yes case from 60-40 in favour to 60-40 against, well, he has said that the no vote was embarrassing. I think it's embarrassing. It's hard for Australia to talk about human rights to countries like China when we still have so many marginalised people here. We are the only ones that don't have a treaty with Indigenous people, so it'll be very difficult so far as international relations. Is he serious? Well, of course he is, but no one will dare want to point any of his flaws out or the sheer absurdity of what he is saying, particularly when it comes to human rights in China. So may I educate Mr Mayo and the press that, of course, are just desperately waiting for the latest crumb to fall out of the dirt file that the Prime Minister's running from his very own office, while his Trade Minister is appointing former Labor senators who don't even apply for jobs. But it's a completely different government. Remember, of course, the Uyghurs are being punished by China because of the God that they believe in. And because China believes there is no other great God apart from the CCP, and I'm talking about the government, not the people here. Remember, take your pick from the far right-wing BBC, where China have been committing crimes against humanity against the Uyghur population. They've put these people in jail. Their goal is to destroy everyone, says a Uyghur camp detainee, with systematic rape. Oh yeah, and of course our government has decided that we don't care that it's slave labour that makes oh so many of the solar panels that will eventually be dotted around Australia at a cost of many, many hundreds of millions of dollars in a total transformation that will cost trillions of dollars, because if you don't believe in any of this stuff, somehow you're anti-climate change. But none of the Greens are planning to put any of these in their electorates, are they? China has used forced labour to make those solar panels. At least the Americans have said that they won't purchase any that have been made by slave labour. Funnily enough, something that has not happened here in Australia. But the dirt unit and Peter Dutton went to Nelson Bay because, yeah, people are pissed off that the pristine countryside is about to be covered in these things that get replaced every 20 years, or offshore wind will just be there whether you like it or not, because Zali Steggall says so. But no plans, of course, to put any around Freshwater or Palm Beach. That would just be offensive, wouldn't it? Meantime, the politics of the Middle East is echoing again around the world, but again in Australia. This weekend, Jewish members of the community and their leaders were rallying in Sydney, and this was an absolutely peaceful protest. Demands for the more than 200 people currently still being held by the terror group Hamas, demanding that those people be released. Something that, of course, we all agree on, right? And what about that particularly poignant moment about the kids that are currently missing or have died?
Why are you holding them? You want humanitarian aid? You want water to Gaza? You want electricity? Release them. That's it. Simple. Tomorrow you'll get everything back. Electricity, everything.
Meantime, bigger rallies in more places than just Sydney, of course, in pro-Palestine after the situation that is unfolding in Gaza and getting worse for the civilians by the day. And as you know, the IDF have currently started the ground incursion, hopefully meaning they are killing members of Hamas, but of course the innocent people whom they live amongst are being hurt as well. Here's something that was said at those rallies.
We need to see that we need people to do something about it. The government, any way you look at it, we need somebody to look at it and say this is enough is enough.
But regardless of who was taking to the streets, can we leave the kids at home? It's one thing to make a poignant point with an empty pram. It's another thing for your kid to be dressed up like this, with the red paint on their hands as well. No one is convinced or moved by this stuff at all. It makes people not just feel uncomfortable, but it makes them feel rageful. There's plenty that the good people who live in this country, who know people in Palestine, have to say that doesn't involve the kid in the full cosplay with the blood on his hands. Meantime, this was Peter Dutton's response to the piss week no vote. And I don't mean no as in we chose no, we just voted nothing when it comes to the demands for a ceasefire that would get more humanitarian aid into Gaza.
The Prime Minister had an opportunity here in the United Nations to send a clear message about our values and where we stand, and he failed that test. And I think it was an incredibly weak display of leadership from the Prime Minister. He should have been standing with President Biden, and to see the Prime Minister, parading around on the red carpet, but then squibbing it when it comes to the tough decisions, I don't think that's in our country's best interests. The difficulty for Israel is that Hamas wants to wipe them off the map. We need to provide a solution, but that can't be done when you've got a terrorist organisation recognised in Australia as such, going around beheading people and trying to conduct these attacks on Israeli soil.
Meantime, in Queensland, is the insanity going to end? Remember the definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over again. And in this case, it's re-electing Anastasia Palaszczuk and her Labor government to rule Queensland, increasingly poorly. As we told you, some new polls have shown that she's no longer the preferred premier, and on two-party preferred, there would be a change of government at an election which is about 12 months away. But we've seen these numbers before, so don't get too excited if that's what you want. But for anyone outside of Queensland who needs to know what the number one issue is, of course it's cost of living, but certainly very close to it, with 75% of people saying that it will determine how they will vote at the next election, is youth crime. Now remember, the very clever fiddling of the books here means that while they're still ripping off cars in Toowoomba, while they're still breaking things in Townsville, while people are still being stabbed or bashed in Brisbane, the youth crime numbers will come down. Not because there's less crime happening, but because, as we've told you, 10% of all of the youth crime is related to drug offences. And of course, possession of many drugs in Brisbane and wider Queensland is going to move to a multiple strike system, which essentially means 10% of the crime will still keep happening. It just will go away as a criminal offence because it's no longer counted as one. But watch this space, because the good people of Queensland have a chance to wake up, shake up and save their state 12 months from now. I look forward to them doing so. Now, we always talk about other people's money, when the people in charge just don't care that you're the one who has to pay for it, doesn't care what the debt is, doesn't care. Now, of course, they wouldn't spend a dare cent on cutting your petrol taxes, but after spending $450 million on a national referendum of which the polls told us for months was going to result in a no because of the arrogance of the Prime Minister not to split the question into two, but no, it was all wrapped up in one. Well, we learned today that this idiot is now going to spend $600 million on a football team in Papua New Guinea. Oh, it's all, of course, about making sure that China doesn't make further pushes into the Pacific region. Rubbish. It's about guaranteeing that the NRL ends up with another team, which means more teams, more games, more money for their television rights. So the taxpayer is going to end up turning around and paying for another football team. Now, if we were talking about a hospital, if we were talking about infrastructure that would mean that when Papua New Guinea gets itself into trouble, they would not turn to China, they would turn to us, that's one thing. But a football team, the total cost of it, $600 million. A little bit like the Tasmanian government with the ridiculous idea for the AFL team there, where the state government has to keep paying for it for the best part of 20 years. And if it's not profitable at the end of the 20 years, guess what? The AFL can take it back. And in the United States, Mike Pence, the former Vice President to Donald Trump, he had no chance of becoming the Republican nominee, let alone becoming the President of the United States, but he has now formally suspended his campaign, meaning he will only forever be known as former Vice President Mike Pence.
I came here to say it's become clear to me. This is not my time. So after much prayer and deliberation, I have decided to suspend my campaign for president effective today.
And the crowd goes mild, because they probably didn't even know you were actually running. Quick break, back with more. Lots to talk about tonight with a power-packed panel, and Andrew Bogut about the politics of sport a little bit later. We're just getting started. A couple of Queenslanders and a lefty from Sydney. What could go wrong? More in a sec. Lots to get to with the Power Pack panel, as I said. A lefty from Sydney and two blokes from Queensland. What's going to happen? Let's all find out together. I wonder if you can pick which one's which. Of course, Labor Councillor of the City of Sydney Council is none other than Linda Scott. One Nation Chief of Staff is wonderful James Ashby. And, of course, national to his bootstraps. And beautiful Bundaberg is lovely Keith Pitt. Hello to everyone. So, dueling rallies in Sydney this weekend in protest in favour of Israel and in favour of Palestine, obviously two very different causes. But it was interesting to see how Australia deals with the domestic fallout of international conflicts. Now, again, when protests go too far, I'll be the first one to start throwing tables and screaming that things should be knocked off. I think the kid in Melbourne with the blood on the hands, that's too much. Linda, again, as long as it doesn't get out of hand, what does it say that something as fundamental as Israel-Palestine has now become something that is a weekly protest event in Australia?
Well, actually, I think it really speaks to the strength of Australian democracy. I was actually in Sydney's CBD today, not at either of the protests, but as I walked through our CBD, there were families heading to the Palestinian protest. I saw people coming back from the Israel protest. The city was absolutely thriving with people coming from the protests or going, but also just shopping and having lunch with their family. And I think it's a great testament to the strength of Australia's democracy and our level of political freedom, which we should never take for granted, that those two groups of people who obviously feel very strongly about this issue can come together, can have a protest, can have their say, and everybody can carry on in complete peace in a thriving global city.
Now, of course, let me preempt the emails or some people that will point out what's being said, which seems peaceful is not peaceful. But in terms of two groups of people who at one point in time police have tried to keep apart, it certainly, there was no form of clash, and I'm glad that didn't happen.
Yeah, today's events I'm speaking about, obviously.
Keith, what do you think here? Because look, again, you know, the majority of Australians, regardless of where they were born, look back and say one of the great joys of this country is how far away it is from the great troubles of the world. But we've also got an awful lot of people who, as the years have rolled on, come from different places than maybe your parents, my parents, grandparents, and all the rest of it. But what do you think when you're sitting there in regional Queensland watching the streets of Sydney and Melbourne playing out the blood feuds of the other side of the world?
Paul, I think it just demonstrates again that, you know, that there's a lot of difference between inner city Sydney and Melbourne and the rest of Australia, particularly regional Australia. And the initial protests that I saw and the reporting and the coverage and what was done there, I was appalled.
Absolutely.
I just couldn't believe it was in this country. I really couldn't. So I'm very pleased to hear that today's events have been somewhat different. But let's be really frank here, that there are 200 plus hostages being held, and it is no surprise to me that a sovereign nation, as in Israel, want to get their people back. I don't think that's a shock. And I think if it was Australians in the same situation, they would be coming to us and to the government to do everything you possibly could to recover their loved ones. So there's no surprise in that to me at all.
Now, James, again, there are people who, I don't know how else to put this without getting in trouble, but I'm going to say it anyway, that are uncomfortable that the blood feuds of the other side of the world are being represented at this point, and with the exception of the Sydney Opera House stuff, which was unforgivable, no question, those people were pro-Hamas, but I believe the people who have been marching in the weeks since are not pro-Hamas. But what do you think?
Well, that might be the case, Paul, but the reality is these protests started off as a vile support of a terrorism group recognised not only here in Australia but right across the globe. There's a reason why there are peaceful protests at the moment. It's because New South Wales and other cities across the country have put on thousands of police officers. Let's not forget there are 1,000 coppers in New South Wales tasked to make sure that these protests did remain peaceful on the Palestinian side. I haven't seen any sign of unrest from the Israeli people and their support. But this is a real problem we've got in the country. We've only got 7,000 Palestinians in Australia that call themselves Australian Palestinians, whether that be by birth or they've moved here and they're from descent. So for a very small number of Palestinian Australians, geez, they make a hell of a lot of noise and racket over an issue of support for, which is for a terrorism organisation. Sorry, but pull your heads in, because this is Australia. Leave those values in the country you came from, and by all means protest, but peaceful protest. The most important thing that we can simply ask for.
Interesting to note, a collection of former Prime Ministers have decided to sign a letter that endorses Israel, condemns Hamas. One of those that have not signed, though, former Prime Minister Paul Keating, who, interestingly, also had an opinion about The Voice, that it was the wrong fight to be having, and did not have much good to say about the way that the referendum had been handled. But again, 2 weeks on from the overwhelming no, the hell no that came from Australia, we've got Thomas Mayo out there saying that it's embarrassing and it makes it difficult for Australia to go to places like China and talk about their human rights issues. I'm trying not to swear at the moment. I'm trying to break a lifelong habit here, but Keith, that's garbage. What's happening in China is that particularly the Uyghur population, that's before we even start with their judicial system and a lot of other things, literally is about putting people in slave camps where they're being sexually assaulted. That was the BBC's reporting. And they're producing things like solar panels and a lot of other things, including taking care of some of the fish supply. And it's all being done under slave labour. So really, I think people need to settle down if they think that a democratic referendum in Australia accounts to anything like what's happening in China.
And I think these are the challenges Mr Mayo and others in the Yes camp had. The United Nations told us we should do it. That won't fly with the Australian people. It didn't then and it won't now. And the idea that we are anything like communist China in terms of how we treat Australians. Most of the Aboriginal people I know, Paul, they're employed, they're out doing their thing. We've got some really challenging and difficult areas, particularly in remote parts of the country. But I'll give you an example on the referendum. Warrabinda, up in Colin Boyce's area, voted no. It's very strongly an Aboriginal community. And these individuals that want to go out and keep talking down our country, well, how about we talk up our country? This is the greatest place in the world to live. Everyone that gets here has an opportunity. And as Mr Ashby said earlier, if you come from another nation, leave your baggage behind and enjoy the freedoms that you have in being an Australian.
Now, again, as somebody who wanted Yes to get up, I understand the heartbreak when you put something into something, and I certainly understand that, I'll give the benefit of the doubt to those that, of course, have been there for years and years trying to get it. They're unhappy with the result. But can we not pretend that Australia's democratic decision about a representative voice to Parliament, that even its advocates were telling us is not a binding thing, is anywhere near like what you call China out for, like the enslavement of people for slave labour in the Uyghurs?
Well, look, I'm not sure any sort of global comparisons in this particularly difficult time for the world are, helpful. We can always politicise them. But I think it is also right to call out that many people, the nearly 40% of Australians who voted yes, but obviously were not the majority of Australians to support the Voice proposal, many of them feel really hurt and upset. And I think that's absolutely to be expected, and there's been lots of calls to find a better way through in Indigenous policy. I've said this before, I think it was actually magnificent that Australia had a very big national debate about how we can improve outcomes for Indigenous Australians, shone a spotlight for many Australians for the first time on the enormous disparities that we see in health, wellbeing, education, jobs. I hope that we all keep that national unity together, try to find solutions.
I agree, and I bet the House on Jacinta Price over Linda Burney any day, but she well may end up in Yarralumla or Government House. All right. Now, let's talk about a couple of other things. On a Sunday night, we get the chance to sit back and sort of look at things that aren't necessarily sort of the biggest news of the day, but they are things that are really changing the way that we live. And I want to talk about this double standard messaging that's sometimes a little hard to decode, James, which is, of course, smoking, bad, put up the taxes as hard as you possibly can, soft drinks, bad, of course we should introduce new taxes on sugar, but completely okay if you walk around with drugs. Now, we know, of course, that there's the decriminalisation that's taking place about possession in the full decriminalisation in the ACT. That came to effect this weekend. And there's the fiddling of things which are happening in Queensland and in New South Wales as well, about sort of multiple strikes. And does anyone honestly think they're going to end up, getting caught that many times that they end up getting the third strike? But James, again, in this culture that on the one hand wants to be an absolute nanny state about what you can and can't put in your body, but on the other side will turn around and say the stuff that's made by some weirdo, in a meth lab, that's completely okay. Wouldn't we just be better to say no to both rather than let's just find a way not to go after the end user?
Yeah, Paul, the public have known people in Canberra have been smoking something a bit sinister for many decades now with the type of policy that's been coming out of there. But it is just unbelievable. Look, I can't get over the fact that you cop a higher price or a higher fine for speeding 13 kilometres over through that main drag of Canberra there, which is signposted as 40. I think everyone's almost got a speeding ticket through there, which is over $300, and yet they're dishing out $100 fines for serious drugs. We're talking methamphetamines, we're talking cocaine. Here in Queensland, they're banning stonemasons because they've got a 10% makeup of silica in their bench tops, and yet here they are saying, hey, go and smoke all this illegal substance, and the worst case you get is $100 fine. It's insane. I just don't understand where the bureaucrats are at.
It's a good point, isn't it, Keith, where if you're off your face on Northbourne Avenue, it's $100. If you go, 13 k's over, it's $300. It's a very good point. But again, this message in Queensland, right, and particularly regional Queensland, where we know that, of course, much of the youth crime is connected to needing to get the money to buy the drugs. So if the government's going to turn around and say, for want of a better term, it's okay to take the drugs, but it's not okay to commit the crime to pay for the drugs, they're sending a strange message, aren't they?
I'm pretty cynical on this one in Queensland, Paul, and I think it's all about getting the numbers down for how many convictions and arrests you've had as you come into the election next October. But in Canberra, mate, I did a little bit of research. If you're out on your bicycle on one of those cultured paths to get your espresso in the morning, and you're dragging around your heroin and your MDMA and whatever else it might be, yep, the fine's $100, but don't get caught without a bell on your bicycle, because it's even more. It's $121, and don't have no helmet. I mean, I survived without a helmet from 1975 to 86, but you can have enough heroin to kill a horse as long as you've got a bell on your bike.
Yeah, again, I mean, my favourite example about all of this, Linda, and I understand the harm minimisation conversation that I'm predicting you may well make in a moment or two, which is that in the drug injecting centres that are in Sydney, you can shoot up heroin, but you can't smoke a cigarette.
Well, look, can I just say I look forward to seeing Keith Pitt on a bike in Canberra. I'll ride along next to him up to Parliament House next time we're both there together with our bells, compliantly.
I usually walk.
Well, we can ride, Keith. It'll be great fun.
Do one of those tandem bikes around Lake Burley-Griffin.
Absolutely. I'm so up for it. We've got this incredibly successful injecting centre in Sydney where there has, since it has opened, not been a single death, right? That is such a significant public policy. Well, I think we should celebrate that people are alive. I think that is a policy worthy of celebration. And it has been because legislators, Bob Carr included, opened it, taking the view that addiction was a health policy issue.
And I don't mind that facility exists, but when the state turns around and says that the greater crime is bicycle helmets and speed,
I don't think that's what they're saying.
drugs.
What they're saying is that fining people, putting them in jail for an issue that is a health issue doesn't create an outcome where people live, people get treatment, people recover, people commit less crime. So we should focus here on the outcome. And that is helping people to recover from the grips of a terrible addiction rather than fining them and incentivising more crime.
Now, we'll get to Andrew Bogut in a couple of seconds. Politics is sport, and there's some woke stuff that he'll knock on the head in a moment or two's time. But a bold prediction for the week ahead. These are legally binding. You should all know that. James Ashby, what's definitely happening this week?
Paul, that's too tough at this time. Honestly, I can't even answer that. I wasn't even prepared for it. There's nothing I can guarantee anyone out there apart from more chaos. Sorry.
Just say the Matildas will keep on winning. Just say the Matildas will keep on winning.
Yeah.
All right, Keith, you got one for me?
They'll put everything to try and get Peter Dutton down and nothing to get electricity prices down.
Great point. The dirt unit is up and running right in the heart of the PM's office. Linda?
Look, I put mine aside tonight. Can I just, on the mention of Bob Carr, send out my big love to Bob, who has overnight, whilst overseas, lost his beautiful wife, Helena Carr. We, the whole, Labor family, and I'm sure more broadly, send our love to him and his loved ones. We hope he gets home safely. I was just messaging him last week about what a wonderful trip he was having with the love of his life. So we're all thinking of you, Bob Carr, and we send you our love and best wishes.
Fair point. And strength and love to everyone who's struggling, no matter what the circumstances are. But, very specifically to Bob Carr. Good point. All right, thank you guys. Do appreciate it. Andrew Bogut standing by. Let's talk about the wokeness in sport next. Feels like a long time since we spoke to the great man, Andrew Bogut. So let's rectify that right now. The host of the Rogues Bogues podcast joins us now from his beautiful home in Melbourne. Lovely to see you, mate. Hope all is well. I'm sure you're excited. The NBA season's up and running again. Are you somebody who watches the games live in the middle of the night, or you turn around and watch it all on demand the next day?
Time difference is good here, Paul. So we usually have them at 11 or 12. But no, I don't watch them every day. I watch one or two a week, maybe NBA-wise. But obviously, you have to follow all the happenings and stats for the podcast, which is now on video too. So everyone gets to see the beautiful face of the podcast now. And
look at this, all that
just audio.
Extra fill light, all the rest of it. Rogues Bogues podcast, write it down, go find it. I'll make sure it's up on our socials. So Basher Hooley, who of course was a legend of AFL, retired just a couple of seasons ago. He's decided to, join the international fray, making very direct comments about what he believes is happening in Gaza. He believes it to be a genocide. He then, I think, has since deleted, but what do you say to this?
I don't know where to start with this. I mean, with these kind of things going on in the world, I've taken a pretty firm stance that I think, innocent people are the ones that cop it on both sides.
Correct.
And for me to cast aside, all I can get is information from mainstream media. And to be honest with you, Paul, after the 2 or 3 years of COVID we've had, I don't trust a lot of the information I'm getting. So,
I'm with you.
I'm all for someone like Basher posting his thoughts and his opinions, whether right or wrong. But if it was, I haven't seen the video in question, but if it was inciting violence or deaths or glorifying any of that stuff, then it's a big no-no. But otherwise, if he has a contra view to what's going on, I have no problem with it. But if it is inciting, then obviously it should be tread cautiously, in my opinion.
Well, also, again, the automatic thing will be here, sports stars with opinions. Well, hang on. What about citizens who have a right to have whatever opinion that they want? I think it's different about being an active versus non-active athlete because you're not connected to the team and the sponsors and the wider family and all the rest of it. But again, good point there. What about women's jiu-jitsu, where women have just walked away from a tournament because people who weren't born women are allowed to compete in it?
Yeah, we need more women doing it. We need, I believe they reversed the decision within 24 hours, correct, Paul? I think
yes, about 21 hours, I think, yeah.
21 hours. So there you go. Women, girls, parents of young girls that are, that there are, males playing in female leagues all around Australia, all around junior sports, all around the world. Boycott. It will make changes, and I'm really happy to hear that, because it's the only way you're going to get these organised. At the end of the day, these organisers make money from fees and running events. If you can hurt that bottom line, they're going to change the rules.
Huge boxing around today. Tyson Fury, he got another win, which means he'll get a chat with Piers Morgan in the next few days. It'll be big on the internet, no doubt. But it was in Saudi Arabia. Now, Saudi Arabia's human rights record is appalling, but they've got billions of dollars willing to spend. Of course, they were able to buy off golf in the past couple of years. They've got events like WWE, and they've got Formula One. How do you feel about this? I mean, in an individual sport like boxing, it's all about payday, and if there's a payday somewhere else, do you chase it, or does it matter where the payday comes from?
Well, look, when you look at UFC that took the same money, they're not, a lot of the UFC athletes aren't preaching to us how to live. Now, I believe there was a few soccer teams, was it Socceroos and some other teams preaching about how, the UAE and human rights, but they still went, right? So if you're going to do it, follow through with what you're saying. But, Melbourne still gets sporting events, and there was a bit of a crisis there the last 2 years with human rights. So, we can't be hypocritical. We had our own issues down here. UAE is obviously a different ball game with certain things in their beliefs, but that's their country's beliefs. We all think in the West that they are not aligned with our values, but I'm sure they think our values are a little bit different to theirs as well.
Now, forgive me for asking, you can feel free to pass it away if you wish, but as somebody who's involved in the NBL, and you're at times looking for sources of money, either as a sponsor or co-investors, if somebody comes to you, now obviously a Russian oligarch, not quite available at the moment, but if somebody comes and you know from where their money comes, would you personally turn down dollars investing in the sport that you love because of where that money comes from?
Well, if you're referring to it being knowingly dirty money or illegal, then no, obviously.
Of course.
But if it was coming from an oil company, for instance, yes, we would take the sponsorship. This is the problem with some of this stuff, right? You're actually affecting the grassroots game at the end of the day. And there's a lot of sponsors that pour money in, yes, to the Sydney Kings or the NBL, but that trickles down all the way down. Now, there's going to be people that sponsor you, and as an adult, guess what? You're going to have people that disagree with political stances, what you're passionate about. Some are passionate about climate change, some aren't. Some think it's not a big deal. Some think you got to move on with that. If someone's willing to put money into your organisation, we generally will take an open mind with that, and their political beliefs are their personal opinions are their personal opinions. But if it's something illegal, that's a whole different story.
Good stuff. All right. Well, all the best for the NBL season, which, of course, is up and away right now. Thank you, mate. Look forward to talking to you again soon. Rogues Bogues podcast, not just audio, but video as well. Links up on our socials. What does $200 million get you for a house in Australia? It's wild, and apparently a lot of toilets. I'll explain why next. The American actor Matthew Perry has died today. He was aged just 54. Believed that he had a heart attack. Now, this was after playing pickleball for a couple of hours at his home, or near his home in Los Angeles. And apparently he was found in his hot tub in the evening that was just past. Plenty of people, of course, remember him from his role in Friends, and quite an iconic figure of the 1990s. Matthew Perry has died. Now, what does $200 million get you for a house in Sydney? Well, a lot. Really a lot, even in the current market of all these things. Now, as you know, people love going to inspect a house that is not worth $200 million, and plenty of people go to auctions each and every weekend for houses that are not $200 million. But the bloke who used to be the boss of Aussie Home Loans, John Simon, well, he bought a house a little while ago, and there's a chance he might be selling it sometime soon in Point Piper. It's quite a flashy joint, as you would expect. It's obviously not as good as the pink house that the ghost lives in, but still. What's inside this joint with $200 million? A gymnasium, a library, a home theatre, picture-perfect view of Sydney's Opera House and the harbour in almost every room. The roof is copper-capped, and there is a 10-car garage and a lift so you can get between floors. Oh, yeah, and 24 toilets. 24? Really? I think they just ran out of ideas for rooms and went, yeah, bathroom, fine. Another one. Imagine the size of some of these things. That's our show for tonight. Thank you very much for watching. The Royal Report's on the telly right now.